Jim Michaelson.
Thanks a lot for inviting me here tonight. Can you all hear me fine? Any of you that have read some of my novels know a little bit of what a stickler I am for detail. Many adult authors will tell you that their fans or whatever, their readership, will contact them anytime there's any error of some type. If it's so for adult novels, it's 10 times so for children's novels. Children will find, if you are trying to buffalo your way through a scene, a child will find that a mile away. And so my writing, I will go to great extremes to make sure a scene is accurate. Now, I'll do it for one reason. That's to make sure that the child gets caught up in the authenticity of it. But I do it for another reason, too. And I will rewrite and rewrite and rewrite my novels, because if a child picks up my novel and reads it, and this is the first novel they've ever read cover to cover, and finishes it and says, I don't think I like reading, my book comes to represent all reading to them. And then within that same breath, I have the power as an author to turn a child onto a life of literature or to turn them off to a life of literature. And so toward that end, I go to great extremes. Now, I have to admit, I'm not sure I believe that writing is a healthy occupation. And that sounds funny coming from a writer. But think about it. You're sitting there for 6 months in front of a screen, typing, fantasizing in a little dark room. I mean, they send people away to institutions for doing things like that. And so for me, I will often use every excuse I can to get out of that role. Now, there are 4, 5, 6 weeks a year when I have to actually sit down and spend long hours like that in the rough drafting process. But once I finish my rough manuscript, then I'm free, because my wife and I take off and I go down beside some waterfall somewhere and I sit there and I rough draft. And when I'm home, I will go out and sit in the cage with my bear Buff and lean up against his fat belly while he sleeps, and I will rough draft. And I will do anything I can to rough draft under more healthy conditions. And my background was a little different, perhaps, than some writers. I was born and raised down in Bolivia, South America. My first language was Spanish, and it served me well in this sense. I was a bad student, so I learned at a very young age what it was like to always feel that everybody else was smarter than me. I was also a minority, to learn that my skin color, there was something wrong with my skin color, and to look at it and know what it was like to be teased, and to have that incredible sense of lack of self-worth that comes with, I think a lot of children feel it in one capacity or another. And I think that's one of the reasons, from having felt it to such a deep degree at a young age, then to remember that when I'm, as a young adult author now, as a children's author, to remember what is it like to be this size, and how your emotions are so volatile. You always feel like nobody in the world has been picked on the way you have. Nobody in the world has been misunderstood the way you have. And so when I came to the United States, my spelling, if I had been able to spell mediocre, because in Spanish, now when I learned English, my spelling was atrocious. And my wife, Melanie, will tell you that she would start editing some of my earlier manuscripts. And Juan, in Spanish, the name Juan is spelled with a J. So what I would do is I would transpose and think that any Hua sound in the English language had to be a J, so I would spell Wen, J-U-E-N. And there were many, many of those types of examples. And I spelled very much phonetically. I could see no reason why that shouldn't be spelled T-H-A. You know, the would be T-H-E. And it was that type of problem. And when I went away to college, my very first year, I was literally still at the point in my word mechanics where I had no concept of commas went. I kiddingly tell the kids what I would do is write all these words on a piece of paper and then start time for punctuation. And this, starting this noise, and sticking in capital letters wherever I thought they'd look good, but no idea that they should be at the beginning of words. Well, I went away to college, and my very first English course that I had, the professor was a very stern head of the English department. And he gave us an assignment to write a short story. I sat up that night and I worked my tail off writing the best short story I could come up with. And I did my punctuation and I did my capital letters and it looked good until I handed it in. And then the next day the professor handed all of these assignments back out, and he actually got up to the microphone. He says, "Ben Michaelson, would you please stay after?" And I remember walking down trembling, and he said, "Ben, you have extreme problems with the English language." And he said, he says, "Your writing ability is at about 6th grade level." And this is in college. And I had always been obsessed with writing, staying under the covers at night with a flashlight in my mouth, scribbling ideas down, but never think it was writing. I never thought for a second that it was writing because my handwriting was so messy. And then finally to have me called down like this and to be told that my writing was at the 7th grade level or 6th grade level. And I remember coming this close to just running out of his office and quitting college and thinking, who in the world am I kidding in this whole endeavor? And I asked him, I said, "Well, what do you want me to do, quit?" And I remember the smile that came across his face. It was a real slow smile. It just kind of melted onto his face. He says, "I didn't call you down here to tell you you had bad spelling. I called you down here to tell you that you're a wonderful writer." And I looked at him as if he was being putting me on. I said, "What do you mean you're a wonderful writer?" He said, "I just finished reading 250 essays." And he says, "There was only one of them that made me laugh and made me cry. It was yours. You're a wonderful storyteller, and that's what writing is." And so that was the very first time that I started getting it into my head that maybe I was a writer. Maybe I was a writer. And I started pursuing it. Now, in the course of writing, a lot of things have molded my writing career. But probably none more than learning that writing was storytelling. My editor, to this day, will work with me endlessly on my word mechanics, on my spelling, on my grammar, as long as I bring her a good story that is me. But if I bring her an empty story that is impeccable, she'll turn it down and never want to see it again. And so it is the story. It is the story. And with children, and when I go into the schools, one of the things that I have a little problem with when I used to come into schools and I would do a rah, rah, rah type talk. That you're all full of wonderfulness. Inside of each of you is this indwelling genius, and now bring your paper onto the page, and each of you has done something phenomenal. Let's spill it out, and that type of talk. And sitting in the back somewhere would be some little child in an abusive home situation that his whole life has been beat on and told that he's worthless. And that little child all of a sudden is sitting there, and he doesn't see that wonderfulness that I'm talking about. And after this big noisy author has left the room, he's still left in his little lonely world, having not found a bit of self-worth. And so now when I go into schools, it's much more base level, working on children's esteem. How does a child that was born in South America, being called Dumb Michaelson by all the other kids, and so silly, but so bad with his spelling, he spelled dumb, D-U-M, and actually signed his name that way. A kid that used to smear shoe polish on his arms because he didn't like his white skin, so he could be like all the others. How did a kid like that ever get to be an author that was published? And we start looking at that process, and it really does start with simple things, like being able to do something like wiggle your ears and everybody else can see it and enjoy it. Learning what the simplest little things are in your life that are of value. I try in my books to set a positive role, set a positive mood. I was up at some neighbor's house a few months ago, and to be totally fair with this story, I want to tell you that my wife and I don't have children, except the 650-pound black one that we're going to be showing you a little later. But we were sitting there before bed, and again, to be fair, the children were tired. It was the end of a long day. And I heard a lot of negativity. I heard the parents saying, don't do this, sissy, and don't do that, and Keith, go get this, and don't do this, and don't do this, and quit this, now no. And I took out my little pad of paper that I always carry around, and I made two little columns. One was no's and one was yeses. And under each time there was a negative or a no, I would put a notch, or every time there was a positive or an encouragement or a yes, I would put a nick in that column. And at the end of 45 minutes, when the two children were in bed, I counted up the two columns, and there was 83 no's, and there was 7 yeses. And I thought, and these are very, very good parents. And then I started looking at some of the other experiences that I had. I actually had gone to a track meet where a bunch of first grade girls were running around this track, and after all the girls had come across the finish line, I saw 2 sets of parents waiting at the finish line. And all of a sudden I thought, well, where are their children? And I looked way down the track, and here were 2 young girls holding hands, walking on the outside of the track, visiting with each other, and stopping to pick flowers. And when the 2 girls came across the finish line, the way the parents reacted was so varied. One set of parents went up, and the father scolded the young girl and said, if you're not going to run and try any harder than that, I'm not going to bring you to any more track meets. You didn't wear your tennis shoes like I told you. You haven't trained. You could have walked on the inside of the track, for Pete's sake, and gotten here 5 minutes earlier, and you don't pick flowers when you're running. The other parents came up to their little girl and lifted her up and gave her a big hug and said, I'm so proud of you. And the little girl, after seeing what scolding her friend had just had, she says, but Mommy, I came in last. And the mother said, last is sometimes a very important position. And the little girl says, well, I could have run if I wanted. And the father says, I know you could have. But we're just so proud that you finished the race. And the last thing that little girl said before she walked away was, Mommy, Daddy, I can run faster. And I thought to myself, if one of those children is ever going to win the Olympics, which one will it be? And there was no question in my mind which one it was. And so when I go out to schools and I work with kids, the lesson I want them to learn is that they're authors of their lives. They can be authors on a piece of paper and write and create reality on a piece of paper, but much, much more important than that, they're authors of their lives. I was at a school a few months ago where there was a commotion in the back. I didn't know what was going on, but it turns out that the football coach didn't want his football players there listening and wasting their time listening to an author, because this was game day. They had a game, and he thought there was much better ways they could be spending their time. And the football coach even made it very clear to me. He came up to me and he says, I'm sure you're a good author, Mr. Michaelson, he says, but realistically, none of my men will ever be, my boys will ever be authors, writers, he said, and we have a game today, and so he said, I personally think this is a waste of their time being here. And I said, okay. Welcome to my home, too. But I mentioned to him, I says, I'm here as a writer, but I'm not here to teach them necessarily to write on paper. If they become writers, fine. I love that discipline of working with words, crafting ideas. But I said, every one of your children, every one of your boys, every one of your players is an author, whether they want to it or not. They are authors. They will do things today that affect reality tomorrow as surely as if I start writing words on a blank page and creating reality on a blank page. And I said, if they have a football game tonight or later this afternoon, I said, what they do, their mindset, how determined they are, their sense of perseverance, their sense of discipline, their sense of will, I said, will affect that reality as much as any other author. And so when I talked on that idea that you are authors of your lives first and foremost. And at the end of the talk, all the football players were going, yeah, go, we can, you know. And the football coach came up to me afterward and he says, Mr. Michaelson, I want to tell you that it was all right what you said. I guess it was, the boys, that didn't hurt them to hear. I like what you said to my boys. I said, good. And they did win the football game. I don't know that I made any difference, but I like that idea. And last year when I went down to the Wyoming Boys School and I talked in this lockdown facility where there's guards all over, and every boy in there is there because they've endangered life in one format or another, arson, aggravated assault, whatever. And one young boy, after I left, he wrote me a letter, and he says, Mr. Michaelson, he says, I don't know how to finish this story. Could you read the story and tell me how to finish it? And so I read the story, and in brief, it was a boy that was being chased by demons across the desert. And all of a sudden, he came to this root cellar of sorts. And he crawled in, and he pulled the hatch over himself, and he huddled in the corner, and the demons started tearing apart the door, the root cellar door, this hatch. And at the end, as far as he'd taken the story, the demons were just about ready to get in, and he was huddled in the corner. And he says, I don't know how to end this story. And it didn't take me very long at all to realize this wasn't a story that he'd made up in his mind. This was a metaphor for his own life. It was a very, very thinly veiled metaphor of his own life. And what he was asking me was, how do I end my life? How do I end my life story? And I thought about it a little while, and then I wrote back to him in a metaphor. I wrote to him and I says, you are a wonderful author. I says, you have written a very, very compelling story. I have no idea what you're going to do to get out of that predicament and that situation. But I'm certain that you will come up with a solution because you are a very, very talented author. I said I would be very interested in hearing the solution you come up to. I said, remember, you don't always have to have a happy ending. You do want, however, a satisfying ending. It was about 2 months before I heard from the boy. And this time when he wrote me, he wasn't speaking in the metaphor. He said, last week I was released from the Wyoming Boys School. He says, I'm with wonderful foster parents. And he says, I just made the first be on their own in school. And there was no longer a need for him to write to me in the metaphor. And so that's the message I like bringing to kids is I want them to be positive. I want them to learn that they count. Even the commandments that we live by have 8 no's and 2 yeses. We are inundated with negativity in our society. And what I want children to learn at a very, very young age is a love for learning. I want them to learn a love for life. That lesson was probably brought home to me really strongly in college when I was racing sled dogs up in northern Minnesota. Traditional wisdom or conventional wisdom in sled dog racing is that what you do is you take the dogs and you let them grow until they're a year old. And then what you do at that point is you set them into the harnesses in a gang line with other experienced dogs, and you begin driving and let them copy by emulation. But very soon in their training, you pull out a whip. And sometime when that dog disobeys, you whip them severely so that they remember the sting of a whip. And this is what most of the mushers did. And then later in a race, when the going is rough, they pull out, they snap the whip, and the sound of that snap brings fear into the dog's mind, and they run harder. Now the man that I raised sled dogs for, the first day I went to work for him, he says, Ben, you will never, ever strike one of my dogs, and you will never whip one of my dogs. A whip is never used around our kennels. And I said, that's good. I feel very strongly the same way. Now, how are we going to train? And he said, let me show you. And he said, grab an armful of those harnesses. There was a bunch of harnesses hooked up to little tiny pieces of twine that were attached to pieces of firewood. And we took them over to the puppy kennel. All these little 6, 7, 8-week-old puppies that barely had their eyes open. He says, put all these harnesses on the puppies. And we started harnessing these little tiny puppies. And finally, we had 24 little puppies all harnessed, and they were clambering all over and bouncing. And I said, now what do we do? It took an hour to harness them all. He says, now we play with them. And we laid down, and for the next hour, we played with them. And if you have never had 24 puppies drag chunks of firewood over you for an hour, you've missed one of the truly great experiences in life. And we did that every other day for the next 3 months. And by the time 3 months was finished, those puppies, you'd bring the harnesses out, and those puppies would clamor at your legs, nipping at each other to be the first in the harness. By the time the puppies were 6 months old, they would actually get into little fights that you had to break up because they wanted to be the first into harness. And then when you grabbed a dog to start putting his harness on them, they would actually raise their paw up to help you put the harness on. And by the time they were 9 months old, those dogs would go into an absolute frenzy when you brought the harnesses out. Because they were learning a very valuable lesson. They were learning that when I have my harness on, and I pull, it's fun. When I have my harness on and I pull, it's fun. When I have my harness on and I pull, then it's fun. And years later, when the going was rough in a race, 16, 18 miles into a race, the dog was tired, had the flu, maybe the snow was deep or the snow had a crust to it and was cutting his paws, and no longer was running fun. All the other drivers were bringing out their whips, but not Bob McWilliams that I race for. Not our dogs. All you do is go, come on, Nishka, come on, girl. And your voice reminded them that this is fun. This is fun. And that fun would kick in, and you'd see them turn around and they'd surge ahead harder than any dog that had a whip on his tail. And that's what I want children to learn. I want children to learn that learning is fun. I want them to learn that reading is fun. I want them to learn that acquiring knowledge is fun. And toward that end, when I go out and do my research, I have fun. Not always is it fun, but I tell you it does get interesting. In the course of my research, I've gone undercover with narcotics agents. I've discovered the very first eyewitnesses to murders. I've been beat up. I've gone down and lived among the homeless in Mexico, eating out of garbage cans and sleeping in the gravel alleys. I've gone to, oh goodness, to Key Largo, Florida, and lived for a month at a dolphin research facility, swimming with the dolphins and studying whale strandings. Next week and Sunday, my wife and I leave for Huntsville, Alabama to go through a 2-week stint at space camp, and then we're off to Africa for a month. I will do as much as I can to make my novels authentic, but more than anything, to have fun, because that's what it's all about. And one of the neatest experiences I've had as an author has been what I want to show you slides of right now, and that's raising our bear Buff. Buffy came to us as a young 16-week-old cub from a research facility where he'd been used in research, and if they couldn't find a home for him, they were going to destroy him, and so my wife and I agreed to adopt him, and I don't know that we knew what we were getting into, but 10 years of incredible experiences later, this is a little bit of what we have. Let's leave the back light on if we can. Can we leave just that? I guess they're all put together. Okay, that'll be just fine. This is what Buff looked like when he was 16 weeks old. And he's grown a little bit now in the last 10 years. He loves to be, he's very affectionate. He loves to cuddle up with you. His body is actually very similar to a, can everybody see all right? Perhaps we should turn the lights out because it'd be a little better than with this many on. Buff is, his body physiology is very similar to a human's, and so he will actually crawl around and he'll sit in the cab of the truck with me, even at 600 pounds, and set up on, and put his arm on the armrest and travel with me just as if he was a human. All of our animals have learned that they have to get along, just like brothers and sisters. Once in a while, Buffy will test the limits, though. I remember last summer, I heard this, and I ran around the side of the house, and Buffy had one of our cats trapped in his cage. She had crept in underneath the storm drain, and Buff has a paw as big as a dinner plate, and he had the cat down on the ground, and he wasn't trying to hurt her. All he was doing was experimenting with the sounds he could make. And so I came up and I said, Buff, I don't think that's what you're supposed to be doing. He looked around at me with this sheepish look and went, The cat took off, and the next day they were playing together. So. But now Buffy is a big bear. It's a hard concept to communicate, but Buffy is not a tame bear. In any sense of the word, if a stranger came in his facility, he would kill them. But he trusts me. He's learned that I'm not a threat, that I'm not going to hurt him. He's actually has held his paw out and let me cut open an abscess while he bites viciously on his other paw. There's a tremendous level of trust there. And Buff right now stands about 7.5 feet tall when he stands up to height. He will actually sometimes discipline me. If I jump on his back or something he doesn't want to play, he'll actually take me down to the ground and put his mouth completely around my face and my neck and hold me there until I relax. And then he'll pick me up and he'll nuzzle my nose and rub his face against mine to make sure I'm not angry at him. We go on many walks in the woods, and playing with Buff and wrestling with him is a little bit like wrestling with a Buick. You always feel manhandled by him, even though he's being very gentle. I actually do spend a lot of time in Buff's cage during my writing process. I will go out and spend 2 or 3 hours at a time editing a manuscript in Buff's facility. Now, Buff comes out of his facility a lot. We go on a lot of walks. He comes in the house. I never let him run totally free because I'm always afraid the hunter will shoot him. But it was in the course of raising Buff that I found the emotions for Rescue Josh McGuire. We had the Fish and Game Department bring us a couple cubs that had lost their mother in the Montana spring bear hunt. And I thought, well, those bad hunters. Well, it turns out that it wasn't bad hunters at all. Even with conscientious hunters, the cubs will wander a long ways away from the mother. And even though we have a law on our state's books that say you can't shoot a mother bear with cub, nobody is going to stand around and watch a mother bear for 2 hours to see if a cub returns to her side. So it was a bad law. And after helping these 2 cubs recover, because they were nearly starved to death, they went back to the Fish and Game Department. A week later, we received a card in the mail saying that because they had been unable to find a proper home, the 2 cubs had been destroyed. And so that's what gave me the emotions to write Rescue Josh McGuire. This is only half of Buff's facility, but you can see the main facility, his tack room. You can see there's a pond there in his denning area. And we go on a lot of walks. Every morning, in fact, in the summer, most every morning we'll get up, and that's part of the very first, one of the more enjoyable parts of the day is to sit there and go on a long walk. And this is above our house, just up playing in the woods. Buff actually likes to climb trees, as the physiology of a bear is very much that of a human. And he loves to crawl up on high points and look out over the countryside. He loves to tear apart old stumps, looking for grubs and for ants, and I think sometimes it's just he loves anything that comes apart. I've seen black ants on his nose, stinging his nose, and he'll be pawing them off his nose, going, ah, ah, and just gulping the ants as fast as he can, not willing to quit eating. They will actually sniff the air whenever he sniffs something in the air. He'll get his nose up really high. He's actually quite a show-off. Bears are kind of fascinating in this sense. They love to be laughed with. They do not like to be laughed at. And Buffy, if he stubs a toe or something in his cage and I laugh at him, he'll stand up to full height and right in my face he'll roar at me and go, ah! And that lets me know very, very effectively that he didn't like me laughing at him. But now if he's doing something funny in his pond and I'm laughing as hard as I can, he'll continue to do it even more rambunctiously. He likes to be laughed with. I feel like I've had an opportunity that very few people have ever had, and that's not only to experience a bear with a level of trust between us, but over the last 10 years raising Buff and spending 3 to 4 hours every day with him, and even spending full hours in hibernation with him, I've had the opportunity to look over his body 1 inch at a time, spend a full hour looking at the top square inch of the inside of his left ear, spend another full hour looking between the two, his big toe and his next toe on his left paw, spending a full hour looking at the top of the inside of his palate of his mouth and seeing the 16 shades of black and flesh color that are on the forward part of his palate, looking at his tongue, the bottom of his tongue for a full hour, looking at the top of his tongue for a full hour. This critter that you're looking at right here is one of the most fascinating creatures I've ever been associated with. And he loves to find berry bushes and strip them. If he finds a real good berry bush, he'll actually run over and come get me and bring me over to share it with me. And then he can't understand why I don't want to share the berry bush with him. Once in a while with Buff, I will try something really stupid. This was one of those times. I don't know how in the world this guy in that ad in the past, I don't know what commercial it was, carried a grizzly in the front. But maybe I should have had a bigger canoe. In fact, maybe I should have had a tugboat. But we got out a ways and Buff saw me paddling, so he started reaching over the edge and helping paddle. And 100 yards out from shore, I knew that we were taking on too much water. So I started paddling madly back toward shore. And Buffy started paddling even harder himself. So we started taking more water. We ended up dumping it. This was not one of my more brilliant ideas. Like I say, all of our animals have to get along. Our lab that we used to have died of old age, but that lab actually, when she was getting older, was still boss because they never changed pecking order. But that lab didn't like to play the way she used to, and Buff would come over and actually push on her with his big paw, and the lab would go. And then when Buff knew that he was getting very close to getting a nip at his tender nose, he would skip taking that risk, and he'd run over to the broom closet, pull out a broom, come back and poke the dog with the broom. Very intelligent. Buff does come into the house an awful lot. He's very, very gentle, very gentle. Once in a while now this is our new little dog that we have that's mostly blind. Once in a while Buff will get a little bit rough with Cokie, and so then I'll step in and make peace between the two of them. Buff has learned that when neighbors come to the house that they're bringing treats. And we have big arched doors in our house with elk antler handles. And so when we have company come over, several times Buff has gone over and stood up to full height and opened the door for them. It's fine if it's a neighbor, but it gets a little touchy if it's an insurance salesman, proselytizer or something. Whenever I've scolded Buff, then what he'll do is he'll nuzzle my nose. That's his way of saying, is everything all right? If I'm angry at Buff, I will not let him nuzzle my nose. But sometimes that drives him bananas too. Sometimes he'll get so upset because I won't forgive him that he'll come up, stand up, grab my head, pull it around, and go, no, 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 no. And up against my nose. It's like, you will forgive me. And this is a new little kitten that we got just a couple months ago called Tigger. And this is Tigger and Buff meeting for the first time. And it took about a month for them to get used to each other. And now Tigger, when I crawl in Buff's den now in hibernation, Tigger will crawl in the den with me and cuddle up with us. And a couple times now in the last few weeks, when I leave the den, Tigger has stayed in there, cuddled with Buffy for an hour or so, and then jumped out. I don't know how they'll continue to get along once Buff comes out of hibernation, but our bear is hibernating right now. And that's why I do a lot of my traveling to schools, a lot of my book signing tours now in the winter. This is part of Buff's facility. This is his pond, and the two dens down below, one is his play den, the upper one, and the lower one, I said, is a serious den, and that's the one he hibernates in. And when Buff wants to play with me real roughly, and I'm not willing to play rough, then he gets such an urge to play that he'll bite on his own paw. And this is what he's doing right now. He's biting his own paw because I won't play with him. And this is the very front door to Buff's facility. The sign that you see above his head is this sign, and it says, if all the beasts were gone, we would die from a great loneliness of spirit. Whatever happens to the beast happens to all of us. All things are connected. Whatever befalls the earth, befalls the children of the earth. And this is Buff's feeding bin. The kinds of foods he eats are a lot of grains like you give horses, and I also give him a lot of produce. We have a couple of grocery stores that give us all their old produce. And it was, again, from the experiences raising Buff that gave me the desire and the feelings. You know, I can go to a library, and the library is incredibly valuable to me. It gives me facts. It gives me a lot of materials. But I have yet to find a novel where I have found the soul of my story in a library. Each novel that I research, sometime in my research, I discover the soul of my story. And here I am playing with the Buick. Buffy actually plays quite gentle, but once in a while he'll roll over and roll right on top of you, and 600 pounds coming across you. As you know, you've just been abused. And then after we play, Buff is very affectionate. He loves to come up and touch you. And he will actually come in the cage there, and I'll lay down, and he'll lay on top of me and sleep with me. And many nights, too, Buff has 102-degree body temperature, and so quite a few nights, my wife or I will go out, and if we can't fall asleep, most people get up and have a cookie and sleep on the couch. Mel or I will go out and sleep in the den with Buff, and often going out to his den and cuddling up with him, he would sleep like a baby. And this is my wife with Mel, with Buff. Buff is good with my wife. He's not quite as obedient with her, but he has learned that she's from North Dakota, and you don't push a North Dakota partner. And once in a while, I'll see him taking advantage of her, and then I'll look out the window and say, "Hey, Buff, how you doing?" And he'll let go of her and look up at me with the most innocent look, like, "Nothing's going on, Dad." This is interesting. You can see how a bear is flat-footed. Their paws and their feet are very similar to ours, except their digits are reversed. Their big toes are on the outside. Philosophically, I don't believe that people should raise wild animals. Now, that sounds contradictory because here I'm showing you wonderful pictures of a bear. But Buff is an animal that would have been destroyed had we not adopted him. But I've seen many, many cases of people that raise wild animals, and the wild animals end up being destroyed. If you raise a dog wrongly, you have a 40-pound problem. You raise a bear wrongly or a mountain lion wrongly, you can have a 400, 500, 600-pound problem that will kill you. And they have instincts that are so different than any domestic animal. And so I really do wish that all wild animals could be wild. That said, I've learned some phenomenal things about Buffy. This is his ears, his hearing. This is his eyesight. He may not have as good an eyesight in terms of acuity as our eyesight, but he always spots movement before I do. He'll see a deer on the hillside much sooner than I do. Now, he may not be able to tell that it is a deer, whereas I can now look and see that it is a deer. Their sense of smell, however, is keen. They can smell you a mile downwind and tell you what color your mom's wedding dress was. A lot of people don't think that a bear has any expression in their eye. The reason is there's no white to their eye for the expression to be reflected in it. If you look very, very closely at that eye, you see how it's brown instead of white where our eye would be? But they do very much have expression. In the winter, my wife and I, even in hibernation, will crawl in with Buff and cuddle up with him, and he'll wake up and be very alert, very affectionate, and he'll his pad up to his mouth, and he'll go nop, 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 and that's his purring sound. Now, when the first snows come, you see some really incredible changes in Buff. He'll add a couple inch layer of fat, and he'll get a big furry coat, and then I know it's time to start getting straw in his facility for hibernation, and he'll take the straw and spread it out and pull it around and shove it and pull it, and armful after armful he'll pull into his den. And he'll work at this for maybe 2 days. And when he finally gets the very, very last of the arm of the straw in, he'll call me in. He'll actually go, ah, ah, and it's call me in to tell me that he's ready for me to come in and say goodbye to him. And then he'll begin his hibernation. Except here, I think the wrong one got to sleep. Then I'll actually call out, and he'll come out to see if I'm going to come back in. And then after that, he goes back in, and that's where he's at now. He's hibernating. Okay, if somebody can turn the lights on. I want to tell you just one brief, quick story before we quit here. My wife, Melanie, has been an absolute saint in the process of my writing and of raising Bob. You get a lot of rejection as an author. Over a 5.5-year period, I received 127 rejections on 3 different full-length manuscripts. And there were times at 2 in the morning when I was doubting the very premise of my novel, and my wife would say, Ben, don't give up yet. We haven't done this for 4 years for you to give up and keep going. So for my writing, I owe her a lot. As far as raising Buff, she's taken the brunt end of the stick there too. When Buff was young, he was learning that he couldn't bite me. He'd get a little swat in his nose or whatever for biting. So he'd come up and he'd want a cookie or something. He'd go, ah. And I would say, no, don't take it. He'd go, ah. And I'd say, don't, leave it alone. He'd get so frustrated, he would run over and he would bite my wife in the leg in the kitchen, and then come back over and want the cookie again. And so every time something happened with Buff, I always tried to not let my wife know about it, especially if he damaged anything. So one day I came home. Now when Buff comes in our house, he has 2 rules. He cannot go on the carpet, and he cannot get in the cupboard. And so I came home one day. Well, what had happened was Buff had gotten out of his cage. The latches had been left off, and he crawled in through the bathroom window. Now, when he got onto the carpet, he knew right away that he shouldn't be on the carpet, so he took and stepped over into the bathtub. In the bathtub, I had never taught him any rules, so he immediately pulled and ripped the shower curtains down and wrapped them around his waist, and he looked like a little sumo wrestler. Then he pulled on the little handles and the buttons until he was taking a shower and he was taking his lips and going, and when he got tired of doing that, he reached up and pulled down all the bottles of shampoo and conditioner and bit them all open, and he smeared them all over his body, and somewhere he got a hold of a tube of toothpaste, and he bit it open and he smeared it all over the walls. Now I came home. We don't have any children. We live up a gravel road where nobody else comes, and I came in the house and I heard the shower running, and I could hear movement. And I went, hello, and there was no answer, and I got a little closer and I went, hello, and all I could hear was this. And I went, it was funny, and I went down and I looked in through the little crack in the door, And here was Buff laying in the tub going. And I looked at my watch and I thought, I have 2 hours until Mel gets home, and then there's going to be 2 new bear rugs in this house. So I went in, and right away, I couldn't scold Buffy. He hadn't done anything wrong that I had ever taught him, so I praised him. Come on, let's go. And I took him out of his cage and I sprayed him off as fast as I could. Then I went in and I went into a whirlwind mode. And I pulled the old shower curtains, threw them away, and I got rags and mops out, and I cleaned and cleaned and cleaned and cleaned. And the last thing I did was jump in the car and race to town, and I bought a brand new set of shower curtains. And these were the expensive ones that I really couldn't afford, that had the cloth around the outside and everything. And I put them up, and have you ever tried in a rush to put up shower curtains? And I was looking at my watch, and I knew my wife was coming home, and I was hooking these things up. And finally, I was just getting the last couple hooked up, and I heard her drive in, and I hooked the last 2, and I raced upstairs, and I sat down in the kitchen, and she walked in the door, and I said, hello. She says, hi, sweetheart, how are you doing? Just fine. Absolutely wonderful. And she said, just a sec, Ben, I'll be right up. I had to go down to the bathroom. Why do girls always have to go to the bathroom the first thing when they get home? Then I heard this, Ben, you got new shower curtains. I went, yeah. The other ones are getting kind of crusty, sweetheart. Then I heard this, Ben, what happened down here? I got up and I kind of sauntered down. Why would you ask, sweetheart? And I walked in and she says, because there's toothpaste on the ceiling. Smeared all over the ceiling. And I looked up and I tried to come up with a convincing story, and I couldn't even come close to thinking of one. But we didn't get bear rugs. But anyway, I would encourage each of you as parents, as teachers, to look at the world as a positive world, as a yes-yes world, not a no-no world. And I would encourage each of you to remember the story about the sled dog puppies. That they learn to love to hold. And if your child can learn to love to learn, that learning is a joy. The future's bright. The future's bright. And I want to thank you very, very much for inviting me to come visit your library and also to visit your community. We've had one day of class work in the schools today, and it was just a joy. And the next 4 days we'll be around the Missoula area. Afterward, if anybody has questions, if anybody wants to see some pictures that we have in the back of Buffy just around the house, welcome to stop back. We do have some books if anybody wants a copy to buy, or if you have brought a copy that you want signed, please feel free to stick around. But thank you. Bye.